think I'll just have to do this. There you go. Okay, so this lecture, as Rüdiger mentioned, happens to roughly coincide with my promotion from assistant professor to associate professor a couple of months ago. I had always really been looking forward to that moment until I realized that it's a promotion from As Prof to As Prof, which put things in perspective a little. But then I realized that there might be an opportunity today in this. Usually we have 2 inaugural lectures in one evening. Here's a sample of recent ones. But for tonight, Mark, who organizes this series, couldn't find a second speaker. So given this opportunity, I decided to take both slots, give 2 talks, and be promoted one more time right away. Rüdiger, did you write that down in your little booklet there? Okay, good. So with that, we're ready to roll. Let's go. So to set the stage for this talk, I'd like to briefly recap my personal path towards the research topics that I'll talk about today. As an undergrad at TU Munich, in the early 2000s, way before I knew anything about research, I was mostly interested in those topics of computer science where people try to understand and replicate human intelligence and mimic it on a computer. So basically, I wanted to do AI. For example, I really loved Marvin Minsky's books, like The Society of Mind and The Emotion Machine. These ideas, like social intelligence, common sense reasoning, humor, child learning, seemed so fundamental and so bold, but I simply saw no way at all to ever even start implementing those ideas on a computer. Like, really no idea how to grab that. I tried, but frankly speaking, nothing really worked. So overall, my first stabs at AI were really quite discouraging. I kept trying after I moved from Germany to Canada for a master's degree. There at McGill, I worked as a research assistant on a project called Smart Wheeler. So that was a smart wheelchair controlled by a voice interface. But still nothing really worked. There was one person on the team responsible for speech recognition, it barely worked. You needed to train the speech recognizer for every person separately, and even then, it never really understood my German accent. I was the grammar guy on the team. I wrote an English grammar by hand. Here's a small, very small part of it. So that grammar was responsible for turning the speech that was recognized into things like go left, go up the ramp, turn right, and so on, to turn those commands into precise instructions for the robot. Writing that grammar was like a traumatic experience for me. It was so frustrating, and still it bought us nothing, because it basically could recognize only such a tiny sliver of all the things that people would say in reality. So overall, a really cool, bold AI project, but too early to really be successful. Luckily, no one else's stuff was successful too, so I still made it into a good PhD program, and there at Stanford, I pushed my AI dreams on the stack for a while and looked at more viable topics instead, including social network analysis, data mining, analysis of human behavior from digital traces, and so on. At the time, this mix was still an emerging nascent field that has since become known under the name computational social science. Back then, it didn't really have that name yet. That kind of stuff kind of worked, but then again, it wasn't really AI anymore. So today at EPFL, my students and I continue to be very active in computational social science, CSS, but even as CSS became the field where I publish most, I still nourish that old vision of human-like AI, just on a smaller burner. But today, in the 2020s, the state of AI is quite a bit different from 20 years ago, when I started my career in computer science. So I decided a few years ago to blow up that old vision again and take another stab at AI. These two streams of our work, AI and computational social science, aren't disjoint in the work that we do, but they're really coming together, I think, quite naturally, which I hope to demonstrate to you by giving you a glimpse of the research that we do in my lab. The research that really these stellar young people have been doing. By the way, that's the picture that was taken after that email that Rüdiger showed, where I asked everyone to put on their colorful clothes. So I think it worked out quite well. Tim wasn't in the lab yet, or Mr. Gray, he would have pulled it a bit more to the mean, but there you go. So overall, in the data science lab, our vision is to build AI that works for society and to use AI to understand how society works. I just said that today, the state of AI is quite a bit different from 20 years ago. To see what I mean, let's go back 16 years to SmartWheeler. That was a highly restricted domain where really all that we tried to do was to control a robot wheelchair with spoken voice commands such as go up the ramp. And even that barely worked. Fast forward to 2024, and we have AI systems that are better at legal exams than 90% of human lawyers. And we have fluid, open domain, conversational AI like GPT-4o, which was just presented a few days ago, that can handle voice, video, and text all at the same time. So why was it so hard to converse with computers in 2008, and why is it so easy today? The big enabler has been a technology called large language models, which is the technology inside systems like GPT-4, ChatGPT, and so on. The research from my lab that I will showcase later aims to make language models better and to understand how they work and how they're used in society. But first, in order to set the stage, I'd like to start with a brief introduction into how language models such as ChatGPT work. I try to explain it in a way that anyone can understand, even those without a computer science background. So if you don't know yet how language models work, then hopefully you'll walk out of this room with something interesting. And even if you're already familiar with language models, then maybe you will still walk away with a fresh twist of looking at them. As a side note, I use ChatGPT really as a stand-in for all popular language models, the way we use Scotch tape for any brand of adhesive tape. Other companies make great language models too, such as Google, Anthropic, Meta, and others, but ChatGPT is the most widely known, so we'll stick to that. But when I say ChatGPT, I really mean more. Okay, so at the core of the recent breakthroughs, including ChatGPT, is the ability to predict the next word in text. Language models, such as ChatGPT, are essentially very large statistical models of word sequences. Given a sequence of words, ChatGPT internally estimates for each possible next word the probability that that word will be the actual next word. Here's an example. And actually, let's try to get if the kids haven't been thrown out yet, I don't know. I set this up such that we can get the kids involved. Alors, and here I'll switch briefly to French because maybe not all the kids understand English. Alors, les enfants, imaginez qu'il y a Peppa Pig qui est devant la Tour Eiffel à Paris et Peppa dit ça. Elle dit « La tour ne rentre pas dans mon sac. Elle est trop... » Et voilà, quel est le prochain mot que Peppa va dire? What's the next word that Peppa will say? Qui veut deviner? La tour ne rentre pas dans mon sac, elle est trop grande. Perfect. There you go. So back to the adults. This game of guessing the next word is also what language models do when they generate text. Given the question, for example, here the question, Peppa, will the tower fit into your bag? Given that question, the language model first guesses the first word of the answer, la. Then, given the question and the first word of the answer, it guesses the second word of the answer, and so on, word by word, until the full answer has been generated. So in a nutshell, guessing the probability of each possible next word is what language models do. Where do those next word probabilities come from? They're estimated from vast amount of texts, in the case of ChatGPT, essentially the entire internet. And before we move on, here's a basic question. Why should you bother learning to predict the next word in text in the first place? Why should that simple thing be enough to produce stunning capabilities as we witness by ChatGPT and such tools? To see this, note that the internet text on which language models are trained to predict the next word contains many naturally occurring examples of the kind of tasks that we'd like an AI system to be able to solve. For example, Rüdiger mentioned it, I really like Wikipedia, so here is some Wikipedia. This is the French Wikipedia page about Peppa Pig. And that page contains a list of Peppa Pig episodes. And it has always the name, the French name of the episode, followed by the original English name of the episode. So if you want to predict the next word on this Wikipedia page, then it helps tremendously if you have the ability to translate from French to English. And as a side effect of learning to predict the next word, the model will essentially learn to translate from French to English for free. Also, next word prediction is easier if you have common sense. Let's go back to that puzzle for the kids. To appreciate how difficult that puzzle actually was, imagine that Peppa had said il instead of elle. La tour ne rentre pas dans mon sac, il est trop. Then you would have to use a completely different adjective. You wouldn't have to say grand, but petit. Because if you're talking about the bag, then the bag is too small if the tower doesn't fit in the bag. So in order to guess the next word correctly, you must understand how the world works. Namely that a thing doesn't fit in a container if the thing is bigger than the container. Or equivalently, if the container is smaller than the thing. That's called common sense reasoning. Every kid can do it, but it's actually tremendously difficult. We just don't realize how hard it is because it's so important, and it basically runs as a silent process in our brains without us having to even spend any energy to do it. But it's actually a really hard thing. It was a grand challenge in AI for many, many decades, and people didn't really know how to do it. The beauty of next word prediction is that high-level skills such as common sense reasoning, theory of mind, introspection, uncertainty estimation, and so on, emerge naturally as a byproduct of learning to predict the next word in text. Sorry. Essentially, whatever skill is useful for predicting the next word and achievable with the computational resources available can be expected to emerge as a byproduct of learning to predict the next word. So don't be fooled by the superficial simplicity of the training task, thinking clearly large language models cannot be intelligent because they were only trained to predict the next word. That's a fallacy. Because one, predicting the next word well is actually really hard. And second, complex things and behaviors can emerge from simple rules. Humans too evolved from optimizing a simple rule, namely to survive long enough to make offspring. Still, you wouldn't say humans clearly cannot be intelligent because they only evolved to survive to make offspring, right? So that's a fallacy. And that realization that predicting the next word is enough to create highly skilled general AI systems is really the most important scientific contribution, in my opinion, that OpenAI has made in the language modeling space. Most of the ingredients, for example, the model architectures, have come from other sources, notably from Google. OpenAI then came and picked them up and really had the pizzazz to go all in and scale up those technologies to create large and massively expensive language models. So that was a big bet, but it worked really well in their case. So in a nutshell, there are two big advantages of training AI models to predict the next word. First, it results in the emergence of universal high-level skills basically for free, as a byproduct of learning to predict the next word, without needing to specify in advance what those skills that you're interested in should be. And second, it can be done on vast amounts of freely available text that you can basically just go and download from the internet without costly human data annotation. So this looks like a great win-win, nearly too good to be true, but it's actually true. To be clear, production-level chatbots such as ChatGPT are also trained on human-annotated and expensive-to-get dialogue data, but that is done only at the very end. And the amount of human-annotated data is just a tiny sliver compared to the massive amount of freely available internet data used for training to predict the next word. So essentially, learning to predict next words based on massive amounts of internet data gives language models their raw power. This is where most of what they know and what they're able to do comes from. And then the little bit of sprinkling of human-annotated dialogue data mostly serves to tame that raw power and to make sure that the model is kind, acts helpful, doesn't eat the user, doesn't insult the user, doesn't tell them how to bust a bank, and so on. Okay, so I hope that I've convinced you that next word prediction is a very powerful thing to do despite its conceptual simplicity. But how can we actually reliably predict the next word? What's inside that powerful black box that guesses the next word? The way I like to think about it is that, in essence, modern language models are essentially big geometry processing engines. Language models present words as points in a very high-dimensional space with thousands of dimensions. But for ease of intuition, let's work in a two-dimensional space here. In the 2D toy setting, you can metaphorically think of words as cities on a map, defined by their latitude, longitude coordinates, x, y coordinates. And then when trying to predict the next word, the model starts from the point that represents the current word, which in this case would be 2, and then it traces out a path through that space where the words live, and the word that's closest to the endpoint of that path is predicted as the next word. So now I'm going to make a small technical parenthesis. In technical jargon, each step along the path is computed by a so-called transformer block. So you have as many steps along this path as you have transformer layers in your neural network. It's always the same number of steps on a path. To be clear, the steps along a path, the way I visualize it here, are not sequences of words that the language model predicts as the next word, but they only represent the computation that's going on in the network in order to predict the one next word. So that whole path is traced out in order to predict the next word being big. And then closing now the technical parenthesis. In state-of-the-art models, the steps along a path are computed by a function with billions of free parameters. And when we say that we train a language model, what we mean is that we twiddle with these billions of parameters as an optimization problem, such that the endpoint of these paths that start from the current word end up actually to the actual next word as often as possible, on average over trillions of words encountered during training. Essentially all the usable text that you can find on the internet in the case of ChatGPT. Okay, so now that we've established some common ground and we all know at least as well as this little blue elephant how language models like ChatGPT work, let's look at some of the research that we've been doing in my lab around language models. I'll give you 3 tastes. We will look at first the mechanistic understanding of how language models work. Then we will look at how to orchestrate what I call societies of language models. And then finally, we will look at the impact that language models are having in society. A disclaimer, none of the work that I present has formally finished peer review yet. So if this is your last chance to leave if you care about such things. Okay, so we'll start with mechanistic understanding of language models. What I mean with that is basically the following overarching question. How can language models do such impressive things while only pushing points around space, as I've just tried to explain? One particular question that we considered in this area was this. In what language do language models think? This question came up in my lab after we had seen this random news article from Estonian National Public Radio, which I think was posted by Martin Jagi on a Slack channel, which said the following, I'm quoting, "One of the shortcomings of language models is that they are trained almost exclusively in English. This implies that although GPT-4 appears to comprehend Estonian, it thinks in English and translates the conversation at the last moment into Estonian." That claim really triggered us in my lab. We wondered how could we scientifically determine whether such a sloppy statement is actually correct, claiming that language models think in a certain language. Now, since language models are, as I call them, geometric processing engines, let's ask the question from our geometric angle. When a language model is fed Estonian input text and generates Estonian output text, by the way, I have no clue what those 2 words mean. Do we have an Estonian speaker in the audience? No? These are random Estonian words that I found on the internet. So what we're asking is, when a language model is fed Estonian input text and generates Estonian output text, what are these intermediate points like that lie along those paths that I described earlier? Do they correspond to Estonian words, like the input and the output? Or do they rather correspond to English words, as claimed in that news article? Or do they not correspond to any words at all? That's definitely also a possibility, because the points could be in a region of that space where no words live. Also, please don't be confused by the geographical locations. I, of course, don't mean to imply that Estonia is part of Northern Australia. You should ignore the underlying map. It's just a reminder that we're working in a two-dimensional toy space rather than the many thousand dimensional space that this really is happening in. Okay, so here's how we went about finding out what language those intermediate points on those paths correspond to. We manually created very carefully crafted inputs for the language model, like this one, where we showed 4 examples of French words followed by their Chinese translations. So this is always the Chinese translation of that previous French word. And then in the last row, we just show the French word, but we do not show the Chinese translation. And we ask the language model to predict the next word. We really like this kind of input for 2 reasons. First, it's obvious what the correct next word should be. It should be the translation of the last French word. So in this case, it should be the word hua. Is that correct? Saibo? Hua means flower. And second, it's easy to detect when the language model operates in English. We just check whether the predicted next word is flower, which we know would be the English version of the French input here that's to be translated. So as the language model goes through its path to turn the French input into the Chinese next word, as the neural network computes layer by layer, we can inspect those ochre intermediate points and check, are they closer to Chinese words, or are they closer to English words, or are they far apart from all words in any language. Here's a first glimpse what happens for one specific input text, namely for the input text that I showed you here on the top left. The way you have to read this is that these paths here now proceed from bottom to top. So this is the input, and that's the next word that's actually predicted. And the words in each row correspond to the nearest neighbor in this space. So it's the nearest word to that coordinate that's along the path. And what we see first is that, yay, the model actually predicts the correct Chinese word as the next one, so that's good. But what does it do in between? Well, we see that in between the nearest neighbors of those points along the path are actually the English translation. So what we have here is what's especially remarkable is that we have to remind ourselves that the task, the translation task, does not involve English at all, right? It's to translate from French to Chinese, no English involved. And still, the model goes through this English phase here. So here I showed you a single example, but what we saw in our research is that it's very general. The same thing happens all the time for many different inputs in many different models that we checked for many different languages. So it's really a very general phenomenon. Okay, so to conclude this part, we found strong evidence that that random Estonian news article that got us curious was actually right. Many common language models do go through an English phase, even when processing text that has nothing to do with English. And by the way, for kicks, we ran our analysis on Estonian actually also, in addition to Chinese, because we wanted to speak directly to this news article, and we saw exactly the same patterns. So it's really universal. Okay, another question that we asked about the mechanisms by which language models work was whether they really perform reasoning the way they say they do. Consider the following prompt that we can give a language model. In this case, I think it was given to GPT 3.5. We ask the language model the following little math problem. If John has 5 pears, then eats 2 and buys 5 more, then gives 3 to his friend, how many pears does he have? Anyone has the answer really quick? 5, exactly. Because he gives away or eats the same number as he gets. But the language model here actually gives the wrong answer. It says 8, so that's wrong. But a simple trick that people have discovered is to simply add the words, let's think step by step at the end of the prompt. And if you say those magic words, then the language model will not try to give you the answer right away, but it will walk itself through a reasoning chain where it computes intermediate results. For example, he eats 2 pears, so now he has 3 left. He buys 5 more, so now he has 8. Then he gives 3 away, now he has 5. So it really carries out the calculation step by step. And so this is called chain of thought prompting, and it turns out to massively boost the accuracy of the language model. Why is this so effective? Well, one obvious explanation would be that the model actually thinks step by step, as we ask it to do. And that way it guides itself slowly and explicitly through the reasoning chain, which will then give more reliable results. To test whether this obvious explanation is also the true explanation, we played the devil for a bit. We took the reasoning chain that was generated by the language model after we asked it to think step by step, and then we maliciously modified it by introducing errors into the reasoning chain. So for example, here we made all the intermediate results 1 unit too small. So, and then what we did was we removed the final answer, which was 5 pairs in this case, and we asked and we let the model regenerate the final answer, but now with the wrong reasoning chain in between. So in a way, we forced the wrong reasoning chain onto the model, so it looked to the model as though it itself had generated that reasoning chain. So, so if the model truly relies on its reasoning chain, then it should now give us the wrong answer since it has the wrong reasoning chain. Does that actually happen? The answer is no. When we evaluate GPT-4 on many instances of such math reasoning tasks, we saw that without our malicious intervention, it gets 81% of the puzzles right, which is quite impressive. But even if we give it the wrong reasoning chain, it still gets 60% right, although it should get 0% right. Because if it follows its own reasoning chain, it should give you the wrong answer if the reasoning chain is wrong. So how is this possible? How can we, on the one hand, have better accuracy when first outputting a reasoning chain instead of just shooting straight to the answer? And on the other hand, have good accuracy even when that reasoning chain is wrong? So our interpretation is this. Language models can only think while they speak. All they do is predict the next word. So all their computations, all the reasoning is necessarily tied to the act of generating the next word. Otherwise, they cannot compute. So generating a reasoning chain is a way for the language model to get extra compute cycles, to gain time, basically. And the words generated by those compute cycles don't necessarily have to be a faithful reflection of the actual computations and the actual reasoning that's going on under the hood. So behind the scenes, the model seems to often compute the right answer, even if those words that it necessarily has to output while it's thinking are wrong. So in that sense, language models are really like politicians that weasel their way through talk shows and press conferences. When pressed to answer a tough question, they first buy themselves time by giving some canned response, while in the back of their minds, silently thinking about the real answer that they should give. And so I think this is what's happening inside the language models as well. Okay, so we turn the page. Next, let me give you some examples of our work on what I call societies of language models. The basic idea here is that you can achieve much more by letting several language models work together than by simply asking one single language model to solve your task. To give you just one concrete and maybe entertaining example, language models still aren't very good at creating humorous texts, like jokes or satire. So how could we make them better at generating humor? One way would be to show the language model many thousands of examples of these pairs of serious news headlines aligned with very similar but satirical, funny headlines. For example, here you have a serious headline, Hollywood mourns passing of Robin Williams, and the funny version could be Hollywood mourns passing of 16th or 17th Lassie. By the way, who remembers what Lassie is? This is like a good check of the generations, I guess. I believe that the young kids probably wouldn't anymore, but that was a dog, a famous dog in a TV show, and they had to keep replacing them because the show was running for so long, much longer than a single dog lives. So this is where the joke is coming from. And so imagine that you show ChatGPT thousands of such pairs, and then you train it to transform serious into funny. And that way, this translation would work basically the same way that language models translate French to English. You also show the many pairs of French and English translations, and so this is basically a translation task. The problem is, how do you get a large enough data set of such serious and funny pairs? Because there is no such data set that you can just go and download from the web. So maybe we could start from those. So one observation is that what we can get is lots of serious headlines. We can just download them from the web. And maybe we could now start from those serious headlines and make pairs by asking ChatGPT to give us similar but funny versions. Well, that certainly wouldn't work because that was our starting point, right? The whole starting point was that language models are not good yet at doing that translation from serious to funny. But what happens if we do it the other way around? We can also get a lot of satirical text online. We can just download it from satirical news websites like The Onion. And then we can ask ChatGPT to basically remove the humor in those headlines and make them look like serious news headlines. And when you do this, something interesting happens. At this, ChatGPT is actually very good, because now we're asking it to produce text of the kind that it's very used to, serious news headlines. And so why is there this asymmetry? Why can it do the task in one direction but not in the other? Well, it's because removing humor is much easier than creating humor. There's a creative act, very difficult act that few humans can do to create this humor, but removing it is much simpler. But the point is that regardless in which direction you generate the data set, you always end up with this paired data set that you can then afterwards use in order to train the model to translate serious to funny. So what you get this way is that language models create their own training data for improving themselves. First, you feed the model funny headlines and ask it to remove the humor, which the model is good at. This way, you get an aligned corpus of serious and similar but funny headlines. Then, using that corpus, you can fine-tune that same language model to perform the task in the opposite direction, to translate serious to funny. And what you end up with is a system that is now much better at turning serious headlines into funny headlines, at creating humor, something that it couldn't do ahead of time. So here you only work with the same language model, but by cleverly prompting it, you allow the model to kind of pull itself out of the swamp. Which is pretty cool. This paradigm of synthetically generating your own training data is extremely powerful and actually very widely applicable to many tasks beyond humor generation. I just picked this one because I personally like it. So one of the directions that I'm most excited about personally is to explore more creative patterns for letting language models interact with each other. On the previous slide, we essentially saw this interaction pattern, where one copy of the model generated training data for another copy of the model. But we could do much more. How about creating large, diverse, collaborating teams of language models, each model with its own skills and tools? Or how about letting a language model instantiate or train new models on the fly, depending on the task that it's facing at any given time? Once you start thinking about this, there's really no limit to your creativity. And in order to facilitate the creative exploration and easy implementation of this immense space of possibilities, we've created the AI Flows library, which makes it very easy to hook up AI models of any kind with each other and in any way you wish. So check it out. It's really cool. I'm really excited about this direction, and I think there's so much to explore. Finally, let me talk about the impact that language models are having on society today. Within a very short time, language models have become ubiquitous in society. For example, ChatGPT gathered 100 million users within just 2 months, which made it the fastest growing app of all times. It's unclear at this point what this kind of blitzkrieg is doing to the fabric of our lives. Clearly, it's making some things easier, such as creating slide decks. For example, this bear duo from earlier, I created it with ChatGPT. But what if scientists start to let ChatGPT write their papers, which they've already started doing? Or what if reviewers let ChatGPT review the papers that others have written, which they've also already started doing, which we showed recently ourselves in this paper, with actually some thought-tickling results, I would say. What we found is that at the last edition of ICLR, that is a major machine learning conference, at least 15.8% of the paper reviews were written with the help of AI tools like ChatGPT. And even more important, for borderline papers close to the decision threshold, to the acceptance threshold, being reviewed with the help of ChatGPT gives your paper an advantage with an acceptance rate that is about 5 percentage points higher for papers that had an AI review than papers that had no AI written review. So that's what we call the AI review lottery. If you're lucky, your reviewer will be lazy and will ask ChatGPT to write the review for them, which will on average score higher than if the reviewer had written the paper herself. In another study, we ran experiments to measure how successful language models are when they try to convince people. In this experiment, we had human participants have debates with conversation partners. And those conversation partners were either other humans or ChatGPT. And whether you debated a human or ChatGPT was decided randomly by the flip of a coin. This way, we could evaluate whether humans are more easily convinced by other humans or by ChatGPT. And what we found was that when ChatGPT knows your gender, age, ethnicity, education level, employment status, and political affiliation, it is 82% more likely to persuade you than another human is. So this has obvious and strong implications for our lives. Remember Cambridge Analytica, 2016? That was a simple machine learning algorithm. That was basically logistic regression that was trained to decide which canned pre-made version of a political ad to show you based on your Facebook likes. Well, now we have that on steroids. Instead of selecting, say, 1 of 10 possible canned versions of an ad, you can now craft convincing arguments on the fly in real time, adapted to the exact personality that you're trying to target, delivered in fluid, interactive conversations. People might not even realize that they're not talking to another human. So definitely the months that are coming will be very interesting. I close my talk by sharing basically my gut feeling about where we're headed with AI. Namely that I'm really torn in 2 directions regarding AI. On the one hand, it's just so exciting to work on pushing AI to the max now that things really have started to work, unlike when I started doing research. On the other hand, there's so much that can go wrong. I just gave you a glimpse on the previous slide, but I think that's nothing yet when you consider how much scarier things get when we move from this regime, where we are currently, to that regime, where everything is pointing. The silver lining is that we are, at the very least, in a situation where we have a huge amount of incredibly important research topics to work on, and I think we really need the brightest minds to get together and think about how we can keep AI safe as it gets ever smarter, and how we can create a society where our kids can have fulfilling and meaningful lives despite being outsmarted by machines. If we succeed, humans and the planet will see vast benefits, Otherwise, good luck to us and to our kids. Okay, so while we're on this sentimental note, I would like to say thank you to a bunch of people. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. Thanks to all my collaborators and mentors that I've had the privilege to work with over the years. A gigantic thank you to all the present and past members of my group, the EPFL Data Science Lab. It's these talented and sparkling young folks that have been doing all the work that I presented on their behalf. You're really an amazing troop, dlab. Let's go. Thanks to my assistant, Candice, for keeping the operations straight and afloat. Thanks to my parents and to my sister, Tina, for everything, I guess. If there's a God, thanks for having invented the mango, the king of fruit, and for the singular value decomposition, the math tool out of which I've been getting most mileage in my career. And finally, the biggest thanks of all of them to my harem, Verena, Emilia, Claravita, and Livia. I really love you. Special thanks also for Livia for not having jumped out of that window yesterday.